I made myself a cup of coffee that morning. Powdered milk, things were getting desperate. I looked at clothes strewn across the floor of the bedroom, stirred the coffee, hair fell forward down my face like Robinson Crusoe I was. I remember it well, but the spirit moved across. In the face of death, it was there. It moved in the air. There was a sound of silence and the voices, the shrieks, the stultified suffocating of the leper-like prisoners of the jail of which I was chief prison officer. Number 1. Member of the executive. Created fear. "You need me," I said. This was the constitution of the new government, the agenda. "For your own good." I looked at the effect on him, on them, all of them. There wasn't much left. Just a few prisoners and a few stragglers and the last of the remnants, and prisoners 10. 10 prisoners. When he had said that I was to be appointed chief jailer of all of the land, I accepted because there were only 10 prisoners. And an architect will come in, he said. An architect, a builder, and they'll build walls. Walls will come in. Walls will come in. It was true. Walls had come in. I'd been sitting in the centre of the middle of the room, and walls, different space-time walls, areas had come in. I didn't know he meant that at the time, but he'd said builders will come in. The builder was appointed by the government of Queensland, the Queen's land. An architect, a designer will come in, he'd said. A designer was made, and now I remember the 2 detectives. The detectives, they caught me in the trench, in the ditch. The plane had crashed. Yes, I was a co-pilot. I was the pilot, and Marie, Emily, I couldn't remember the name. There was a blockage in the dead centre of my brain where a target would be. It seemed as if it was a target, and I had a strange memory, as if I was the pilot of a jet plane and flew straight into that target, went through, like amazingly going through a wall, and took pictures of the terrain inside of the vein of my mind, the mine, as the plane dived and went in. Pictures were taken, I vaguely remembered. We were told by the colonel. We had to dive, take the pictures, come back, return, examine the pictures in the X-ray, and then work out what to target again. These areas, they were all infected by communists. Was it the enemy, or were they affected by capitalists, the enemy? Or I'd lost track of who was who. The DNA was all overlapping, matching. You see, I'd been in the lab and I'd been operating on this DNA technique that we'd developed, and there was just one little strip of DNA that we'd extracted as a sample. But there wasn't enough. It didn't show the rest of the royal line. It was all contaminated. So we'd done a trick. A practice. We called it a standard practice, but we doubled over what we had. We doubled the little piece of DNA, so we had enough to examine to see if there was a match. We cloned it, so we had 2 links. We doubled it. You see what I mean? And then we matched it. We tried it against the remnants of the woman that we had, the co-pilot. We saw that it was an exact match. That's what we called it. Well, not quite exact, but there was a high point on the left, I noticed, like a sort of a finger of a mountain, and that matched the royal line, the extraction of DNA that we had from the one of the living members of the line who was left, that finger. And there was a smaller finger below it, and that matched as well. But on the right, on the other side, where you would find the masculine side of the head, the brain, the right, there was no match. There was no match of the sample at which we looked up on the X-ray on the screen, which I brought back from the flight, and that piece of the royal line, the man who was living, that extraction that we'd taken from the hair, that didn't match. So we decided to clone the right-hand side. Well, we cloned the left-hand side also, but we discarded that. It was junk, you see, we regarded it. But we cloned the right-hand side, the area that didn't match, and we declared in a declaration, we announced it to the whole village and the kingdom that was left, with pageantry and pomp, that there was no match. She was not Annie. We declared it quite categorically. It was, well, 100% obvious she was not Annie. It was a declaration. I went down into the history books, and that's that. But I suddenly realised that by doubling, we'd manipulated the DNA. We'd cloned, and this altered the DNA. I could hear them coming to get me. It sounded like one of those vans that they drove with the, the television X-ray circling round and round, trying to pick up my voice, pick me up in the attic. I'd left the window open. That was the trouble. I needed another drink of coffee. Excuse me. I looked at the clothes that lay around the bedroom, and I almost imagined that there was they'd become another persona that lived, and it had been so long, that lived in this room, and I ate, drank, and had coffee every day with them. Excuse me. Yes, thank you. Now, Annie, I have to confess, because this is my confession in this day in 2000, and I can't even find a calendar. I ripped it off on July the 6th. Was it I, or was it the others from those behind those walls? But what I'm trying to say, what I'm saying to you, my dear fellow, my dear boy, is that when we cloned this little piece of DNA of hers, the co-pilot, Annie, we altered her DNA. But it was a manipulation. So it wasn't the original DNA that was extracted from her remains. That's what I'm saying. I mean, you may ask in administrative law, if you have a altered basis, then how can you draw a conclusion from that basis which is valid? And particularly under the statute. I mean, after all, when I was the delegate, I was given power under the statute by the Parliament to exercise that power and make a decision on this DNA particular instance in this lab. And if obviously the basis was defective, then I've never actually legitimately exercised my power, because as Lord Denning said, he was a judge who was dead and no longer here, as he said, nobody is given power to exercise illegitimately, wrongly. If you exercise the power wrongly, you haven't exercised the power. That was it. God gave us the power to exercise rightly. That was what he was saying. So this decision made on this altered basis could not be called an exercise of power. The decision was ultra-virus. Speaking of which, there were plenty of viruses around here, and this was ultra-virus, maybe. But what I'm trying to say is that this decision was wrong. And then it became clear, because I was one day in the lab and I noticed that Professor, I can hardly remember his name, but he was very august, and he was head of the Great Britain Laboratory. That was it, Great Britain. And he had said that he was examining the DNA technique, the procedures, the system of matching. And he had said, well, just out of instance, I decided just to flick in my own DNA and see what came up, just as a sort of silly little whim, and see what happened when I compared it with the King's. the remnants of the skeleton of the kings which had been found in a trench, the trench that I mentioned before, into which I crashed in the plane. So this professor, he compared it, and my God, his own DNA came up, as he said in his diary, quote, very nearly a match, quote unquote, very nearly a match. I'll say it again, quote unquote, with the king's DNA that we had found as a sample, or as the professor said, a sample in the trench, in the skeleton in the crash. And he was unrelated. I thought that I would choke on seeing this, because it meant that anybody, possibly, who's unrelated can just be a match. I mean, we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, aren't we? Or various groups of, 8 families, perhaps? So there's bound to be some common DNA in all of us. In fact, there's probably quite a lot of it. Maybe mostly we're common DNA. And after all, we were all peasants in the beginning, weren't we? And I don't mean that in a derogatory fashion. We were all working on the land, and a king, a family, was chosen. So it stands to reason, in fact it must be, that we have common DNA. So that meant that the professor, the conclusion was drawn, the professor was the king, or the Tsar. And he's disappeared now, so presumably he was identified as the Tsar. They concluded that the Tsar must have escaped, because after all, there he was as the professor, because at that time everything was rigid and streamlined and concretely based and interpreted, and it was therefore declared that he was the Tsar, the king. And Professor, oh my God, I wish I could remember his name. Professor David, I can't. Well, anyway, I witnessed this myself. He was taken out and shot as the Tsar. There was no question. I mean, we all were fond of him, but there was no point. The conclusion, under law, under legal thinking, was that there was a conclusion drawn that he was the Tsar. The conclusion was deemed, he was deemed the Tsar, but there was evidence that the Tsar was killed in the early 20th century. But there were only 2 bullet holes found in the cellar. And to my astonishment, I could remember that the daughter, Annie, she'd said that the German general had visited in winter in 1916. How could anyone know that unless they were Annie? So the DNA reading, but of course the DNA excluded the area that was like a finger and a thumb. The smaller area next to it was like a thumb. And that area, well, there was junk. They called it junk, all this contaminated area. And then I remembered a newspaper report saying that DNA, a breakthrough, contaminated areas, so-called junk, is absolutely vital, absolutely relevant. So certain information there'd been no consideration of. The information had not been taken into account. Well, the decision was procedurally ultra vires. Incorrect. And, of course, to my surprise in the lab, I also noticed that the procedure, in any case, had been superseded. It had been obsolete, declared obsolete, and substituted with a much wider database to take in further information. And that in itself had been superseded. So the original decision, what was it, 1996, in the Annie case, was defective. Unblocked. Incorrect.